There is a neighborhood in Beirut where strangers do not last long. Not because they are killed, because they are noticed. Every face that does not belong gets catalogued, by the shopkeeper who never seems to be watching, by the teenager on the corner who is always on his phone, by the woman in the window who appears to be hanging laundry at the same hours every day. In the Dahiya, southern Beirut, the machinery of suspicion runs constantly, quietly, and without pause. In 2003, a woman walked into this neighborhood carrying a nursing bag and a Lebanese identity card. Her name, according to that card, was Lina Farhat. She was 31 years old. She spoke the local dialect without an accent. She knew the streets, the shop names, the particular rhythm of a neighborhood that had been shaped by 20 years of war and survival. She knew which mosque broadcast its call to prayer 3 minutes late and why no one mentioned it. She knew exactly what a woman from this community sounded like when she was comfortable, and what she sounded like when she was not. She had been practicing for 4 years. Her real name was not Lina Farhat. She was a Mossad case officer, alone, under full alias, in the most surveilled quarter on Israel's intelligence map. And she had just accepted a nursing assignment that no one in Tel Aviv had planned for, that had not appeared in any operational scenario, and that would place her, twice a week, in the private residence of a mid-ranking Hezbollah commander who was recovering from a wound he could not explain to a hospital. The question is not whether she was good enough to survive it. The question is what it costs a person to be believed, as someone they are not, by someone who had no reason to doubt them. To understand what Lina Farhat was doing in that neighborhood, you have to understand what Mossad had lost in the decade before she arrived. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Israel had built an extensive human intelligence network across Lebanon, recruited assets from Druze communities, Christian business networks, Sunni municipal officials. People who passed information in exchange for money, ideology, or protection. At its peak, the network was one of the most productive human intelligence operations in the region. Hezbollah studied it. They studied it the way a defense studies an offense, looking for the patterns, the approach angles, the behavioral signatures of a person who had recently been recruited and was now reporting to a handler. And over years of patient, systematic counterintelligence work, they began dismantling what Israel had built. Contact by contact. Network by network. By the early 2000s, the architecture that had taken a decade to construct was partially collapsed. Israel needed something different. Not a recruited local. A planted presence. Someone who was not merely loyal to Israel, but who was, by every observable measure, not Israeli at all. The woman who would become Lina Farhat had been selected for this kind of work several years before she ever entered Lebanon. The selection process for deep cover operations at Mossad does not reward the most aggressive candidates. It rewards the ones who can sustain discomfort without showing it. The ones who can be asked a question they did not prepare for and find an answer that sounds like memory rather than construction. She was one of those. The legend, the false identity, had been built over years. Lina Farhat had a documented history in a city where documentation was loose enough to contain gaps without raising questions. She had references from a medical facility that would, if checked, produce confirming voices. She had a community backstory calibrated to the specific dialect and cultural texture of southern Lebanon. She had spent months immersed in that community, not to learn the language but to absorb the things that cannot be learned from a file. The complaints people make about the cost of bread, the way old men talk about the Civil War when no one is writing anything down, the specific humor of a neighborhood that has been through too much to take anything entirely seriously. She arrived in Beirut as a private nursing contractor and began taking shifts at a small clinic in the Dahiya. For the first 8 months, she did nothing operationally. She worked. She built a life. She learned which families came in regularly, which men arrived without appointments and left without filling out forms, which staff members she could talk to, and which ones it was better to leave alone. She was constructing, slowly and without urgency, the thing that no forged document can supply: the texture of belonging. In Tel Aviv, her handler reviewed her reports and waited. There was a designated target, a Hezbollah commander whose movements had been partially mapped through signals intelligence. The plan was gradual approach, cultivated contact, a recruitment that would unfold over another year at minimum. Then, in the summer of 2003, the target was injured near the southern border. The details of the injury are not in any publicly available record. What is documented through intelligence histories and investigative journalism is that Hezbollah maintained a private medical support structure for personnel whose treatment could not appear in any hospital system. Private physicians, trusted pharmacists, and in some cases in-home nursing care for those whose injuries required ongoing management but whose names could never enter a registry. The commander referred to in what limited sourcing exists by the alias Abu Tariq was placed in this private care structure. He needed someone with clinical training, someone from the community, someone whose presence in his residence would not register as unusual. The arrangements moved through an informal referral chain, a physician who knew a contact, who knew someone, who knew Lena. She was described as reliable, experienced, discreet. No one ran a formal check. When she reported this through her dead-drop communication system, Tel Aviv went quiet for a long moment. The operation had been built for a slow, managed approach. What had just happened was the opposite. The target's own support network had selected their agent to provide his personal medical care. There was a serious internal discussion about whether to accept. Every additional week in proximity to a senior operative was another week of accumulated exposure risk. A question answered incorrectly. A detail she could not have known. A visitor who looked at her face for 3 seconds too long. The risks were not theoretical, but the alternative was withdrawing a deep cover asset after 4 years of investment at the precise moment the operation had generated access no planning could have manufactured. The decision was made to proceed. With one constraint, non-negotiable, issued from the top of the chain, she was not to push for intelligence. She was to provide genuine nursing care and let trust develop at its own pace. This constraint would later become the most consequential decision of the entire mission. At the time, it felt like caution. She accepted the assignment and walked into Abu Tariq's residence for the first time on a weekday afternoon in late 2003. He was in his 40s. A careful man. The kind of person who had survived internal Hezbollah politics and Israeli pressure through a combination of competence and wariness. He watched her complete the first wound assessment with the patience of someone who had learned that the people worth trusting were the ones who did not try too hard to be trustworthy. She did not try. She worked. She dressed the wound with the clinical attention of someone who had spent months studying exactly this, and she left when the work was done. She had been told to let trust develop at its own pace. What no one in the operation had factored for, what no operational plan accounts for, because it cannot, was the possibility that the target would begin trusting her not as a service provider, but as a person. Not yet. It was too early. But she had been in that room long enough to recognize the beginning of it, and she understood, in a way she would not put in her report, that this was either the operation working exactly as intended or the beginning of something that none of the planning had prepared for. She packed her nursing bag, said she would return on Thursday, and walked back out into a neighborhood that had already filed her face under trusted and stopped watching. No one in the Dahiya had any reason to look twice at a nurse leaving a house. No one except, perhaps, the question of what she was going to do the day someone finally did. She returned on Thursday. And the Thursday after that. And the one after that. 6 weeks passed in the rhythm of clinical routine, wound assessment, dressing change, medication check, brief exchange about nothing that mattered, departure. Abu Tariq said little beyond what the medical situation required. He watched her in the way that careful people watch things they are not yet prepared to trust completely. Not with hostility, with the patient attention of someone running a long calculation. She understood this. She had been trained to understand it. She did not rush it. What she had not been trained for was the specific texture of being trusted slowly by a man who was very good at not trusting people. Because slow trust, when it finally arrives, carries a different weight than the kind that comes easily. It has been tested before it is extended, and when it arrives, it is not casual. It is a decision. The first sign came in the 8th week. He remembered something she had said the previous visit, not something significant. A passing comment about the neighborhood, about a particular bakery that had changed ownership and lost something in the change. He referenced it. Not to test her, to continue it. The way people continue conversations with someone they have decided is worth continuing conversations with. She responded naturally. She had, in fact, meant what she said about the bakery. This is the detail that matters. The small things she said as Lina Farhat were not all invented. Some of them were simply true things said by a woman who had spent enough time in this neighborhood to have genuine opinions about it. The cover and the person inside it had begun, in small ways, to overlap. This is what deep cover training prepares you to manage. It does not always prepare you for how it feels when the management becomes difficult to distinguish from the reality. In Tel Aviv, her handler had begun reviewing her reports with a different kind of attention. The collection phase had not formally begun. She had not been asked to steer conversations or solicit information. But the reports from this period contained something valuable in aggregate, the kind of ambient detail that an experienced analyst could use to begin building a structural picture. The names Abu Tariq mentioned in passing. The days when his residence had a different kind of traffic. The references to organizational matters that he did not explain because, from inside his world, they required no explanation. None of it was a secret handed over deliberately. All of it was intelligence. Tel Aviv made a decision. They wanted to accelerate. The relationship had developed faster than the original timeline projected. A window was forming. Her handler sent the instruction, begin moving conversations toward areas of operational value. Not directly, not with questions, with the kind of angled engagement that guides a source without the source recognizing the guidance. She received this instruction and sat with it for a period she would later describe, in terms that do not appear in the official record, as the first moment she felt genuinely afraid. Not afraid of Abu Tariq. Not afraid of Hezbollah counterintelligence. Afraid of herself. Of what she was about to introduce into something that had, to this point, been clean. Because the relationship had built on one thing above everything else, she had not performed warmth. She had not manufactured interest. She had been present, professionally and humanly, in a way that was real enough to register to a man trained to detect what was not real. The moment she began steering, even subtly, even with the lightest possible hand, she was introducing a layer of performance that had not been there before. A man who had survived this long had developed sensitivity to exactly that kind of shift. She complied with the instruction. But she modified the approach in a way she did not fully disclose to her handler. Rather than angling conversations toward operational areas, she began offering more of herself. Small disclosures about Lina Farhat's life, selected carefully, genuine in texture, designed to invite reciprocity. Not extraction. Exchange, the kind that feels social because it is social, even when it is also something else. It worked. Over the following weeks, fragments surfaced, meeting locations he avoided on certain days, the names of people he mentioned without explaining why they mattered. References to internal Hezbollah tensions that, cross-referenced with signals intelligence in Tel Aviv, began producing a picture neither source could have built alone. She was producing. The operation was advancing. And she was lying to her handler about how she was doing it. The fracture, when it came, did not come from Abu Tariq. It came from a visitor. 10 weeks into the collection phase, a young man arrived at the residence during one of her scheduled visits. He had not been there before. He came in without announcement, which meant either he was not subject to the entry protocols that governed most visitors, or those protocols did not apply to him in the way they applied to others. Neither possibility was comfortable. He sat in the adjacent room. He was visible from where she worked. He did not speak to her. But he watched her in a way that was different from how the household staff watched her, different from how Abu Tariq had watched her in the early weeks. There was no patience in it. It was the watching of someone who had already formed a question and was waiting to see whether the answer appeared on its own. She completed the dressing change. She gave Abu Tariq his medication notes. She said she would return on the usual day. She left. On the street, she did not change her pace. She did not look back. She walked the route she always walked and entered the dead drop protocol through a sequence of ordinary-seeming stops. A shop. A different street. A moment of apparently spontaneous window browsing that she had rehearsed until it produced no observable signature. Her report that night contained 2 words she had partially overheard as she left. The young man had said something to Abu Tariq in a register too low for her to catch clearly. 2 words carried. She reported them. Tel Aviv spent 48 hours assessing what those words meant. The conclusion was not reassuring, ambiguous. They could indicate suspicion. They could indicate something entirely unrelated to her. There was no way to determine which, and there was no way to find out without taking an action that would itself be a signal. Her handler raised the question of abort, not as a recommendation, as a requirement of protocol. When operational exposure risk crosses a defined threshold, the abort question must be formally raised and answered. The answer requires the field operative's input because the field operative is the only one with real-time access to the texture of the situation, the things that do not transmit through a dead drop report, the things that live in the room and cannot be described fully in writing. She gave her assessment. She did not believe the visitor's attention was conclusive. She believed, and she was precise about the limits of this belief, about what it was grounded in and what it was not, that Abu Tariq's behavior toward her had not shifted, that a man who had decided to be suspicious of a person in his medical care would produce some detectable change in how he managed her presence. She had seen none. The handler accepted this assessment. The operation continued. What she did not include in the assessment, because including it would have required acknowledging something she was not yet prepared to acknowledge to anyone, was the reason she was most confident that Abu Tariq's trust had not been disturbed. It was not analytical. It was not grounded in operational observation alone. She was confident because she could feel it, because she had been in that room long enough, in a relationship sustained enough, that she had developed a read on him that was not entirely professional, that existed in a register she had no operational language for. She trusted her read of him in the way you trust your read of someone you know, and the word know was the problem. Because she was not supposed to know him. She was supposed to be managing a source. The line between those 2 things had moved. She was not certain when. She was not certain how far. Here is what the operational record shows from this period, and here is what it does not show. It shows increasing intelligence yield. It shows a mission tracking ahead of the revised timeline. It shows a field operative managing a sensitive penetration with, by any measurable standard, exceptional professionalism. What it does not show is this. The deception had, by this point, succeeded. But it had not succeeded for the reason Mossad planned. It had not succeeded because the legend was perfect. The legend had gaps that a sufficiently motivated investigation would have found. It had not succeeded because her clinical cover was impenetrable. It was good, but it was not without seam. It had succeeded because Abu Tariq had decided at some point in the preceding weeks that Lena Farhat was someone he wanted to believe in, and that decision, once made by a man like him, became its own defense. He was not passive in his trust. He was, without knowing it, actively protecting it. The deception worked because the target was, in some fundamental way, sustaining it. This meant the operation was no longer entirely in Mossad's control. It was partly in his, in the belief of a man who was being deceived, in the need that belief was quietly serving, in the thing he was finding in that room that had nothing to do with wound management, and that he would have been unable to name if asked. And she knew this. She had known it for weeks. She had not reported it because there was no field in any operational report designed to contain the following information: the mission is succeeding in part because the target has developed something genuine, and the operative is aware of it, and the operative does not know what to do with that awareness in a way that does not compromise either the mission or herself. Thursday came again. She picked up the nursing bag. She went back. He said that she had heard it wrong and gave her the correction. She did not react. She nodded in the way that Lena Farhat would nod, mildly interested, mildly embarrassed at the error, entirely unsuspicious of her own role in producing the exchange. She moved the conversation on within 30 seconds. She did not return to the area. She completed the visit, administered the medication notes, said Thursday, and left. On the street, she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not relief. Not the professional satisfaction of a technique working as designed, something closer to nausea. Because the correction he had given her was not a small thing. It was precise. It was the kind of precision that only came from someone who sat inside the structure she was mapping. And he had given it to her without hesitation, without suspicion, without any of the caution that had defined him for the first months of her visits. He had trusted her enough to correct her. She had engineered that trust to extract that correction. She filed the report that evening. It was, by any operational measure, the most productive single exchange of the entire mission. Tel Aviv's response arrived within 24 hours. 2 words: continue collection. She read it. She destroyed it. She told herself this was the job. The false release came 3 weeks later, and it nearly ended everything. Abu Tariq had a good day. Genuinely good. The kind that is visible in a person before they say anything, in how they hold themselves, in the pace of their speech. His wound had healed to the point where the dressing was now largely precautionary. He was moving more freely. He was, for the first time since she had known him, relaxed in a way that was not managed. He talked. More than he had in any previous visit. Not about anything operationally significant. About his childhood. About a place he had grown up near. About a particular quality of light in the late afternoon that he associated with a specific memory he did not fully explain. The conversation had the texture of something unguarded. Something that did not belong to the operational register of his life. She responded in kind. Not strategically. She simply responded, as Lena Farhat would, as a person sitting with another person who was, for a moment, not carrying anything heavy. This was the mistake. Not a tradecraft mistake. A human one. Because in that unguarded space, she said something that was not in the legend. A small thing. A reference to a place framed as a memory that belonged to her actual history rather than Lena Farhat's constructed one. It was not a dramatic exposure. It was the kind of slip that happens when a person has been sustaining a performance for long enough that the boundary between performance and self becomes momentarily permeable. She did not realize she had done it until she was already past it. Abu Tariq did not react. The conversation continued. He did not pause, did not return to what she had said, did not look at her differently. By every observable measure, it had passed without registering. She completed the visit. She left. That night, she did not sleep. She reconstructed the moment 11 times. She assessed it from every angle she could access. The reference had been oblique enough that it required context she had not provided to become a contradiction of the legend. Without that context, it was simply a detail. A place name. Something a person might have visited, might have heard about, might have absorbed from a dozen ordinary sources. It was not necessarily a thread that, if pulled, unraveled anything. But she did not know whether he had noticed it and chosen not to react, or whether he had genuinely not noticed. And those two possibilities required completely different responses. If he had not noticed, she could continue. If he had noticed and said nothing, She was already in a different situation than she understood herself to be in, and the danger was not in front of her but already present, already accumulating, while she sat in a room somewhere believing the cover was holding. She drafted an abort recommendation. She wrote it out fully, routed it to the dead drop, and then retrieved it before it was collected. She retrieved it because she realized, sitting with the decision, that the abort recommendation was not grounded in operational assessment. It was grounded in fear. Not fear of Hezbollah, fear of the slip itself. Fear that she had let something real come through the constructed surface, and that this meant she was no longer the person who should be in that room. These are different fears. The first one is operational. The second one is personal. She had been trained to act on the first. She had not been trained to distinguish it cleanly from the second when they arrived at the same moment in the same body. She did not file the abort. She filed a report that noted a minor inconsistency in her cover narrative, assessed as low risk, self-corrected, no observable response from the target. It was an accurate report. It was also an incomplete one. Thursday came. She arrived at the usual time. The household staff admitted her without ceremony, which was itself a kind of answer if Abu Tariq's posture toward her had shifted. It would have produced some change in how his environment managed her arrival. It had not. He was in the usual room. He looked well, better than the previous visit. He greeted her in the way he had been greeting her for months, with the particular economy of a man who does not perform warmth but has begun to extend it without thinking about it. She began the wound assessment. Halfway through, he said something she had not prepared for. He said he had been thinking about what she had mentioned, the place she had referenced. He had a connection to that area himself, he said. He had not thought about it in years. Hearing her mention it had brought something back. He was not suspicious. He was reminiscing. He had heard the reference as a coincidence, a point of shared geography, an unexpected thread between two people who had found themselves in the same room for reasons neither of them had chosen. She responded. She built on the reference, carefully, folding it back into the legend with a detail that made the original slip look like intentional disclosure rather than accident. She gave him a version of the memory that belonged to Lena Farhat, that was consistent with everything Lena Farhat was supposed to have been. He accepted it without question. The conversation moved on. She had just watched an exposure become a bond. The slip had not weakened the cover. It had deepened it. The thing she had said by accident, the one real detail that had come through the constructed surface, had produced in him exactly the response that months of careful performance had been designed to produce, the feeling that he knew her. That there was something between them that was not just professional proximity. He trusted her more after the slip than he had before it. She completed the visit. She gave him his medication notes. She said Thursday. She left. On the street she understood something that had not been in any training, that was not in any operational protocol, that no handler had prepared her for. The deception was not holding because she was good at maintaining it. It was holding, in part, because she had failed to maintain it. Because something real had come through. Because a man trained to detect performance had detected, in one unguarded moment, something that was not performed, and that authenticity had done more for the cover than 4 years of constructed legend. The operation was working. And part of what was making it work was her. Not the version of her that was Lena Farhat. The version underneath. She did not know what to do with this. She walked the exit route. She made the stops. She filed the report. The report said, collection continuing. Target stable. No new exposure risk. Every word of it was accurate. None of it was complete. The exit did not arrive as a decision. It arrived as a medical fact. The wound had healed. Not partially, not functionally, fully, to the degree that ongoing nursing visits could no longer be justified by any clinical standard that a careful observer would accept. She had extended the pretext as long as the extension was credible. supplementary medication management, nutritional follow-up, the kind of attentive aftercare that a thorough nurse provides and that had bought her an additional 6 weeks beyond the natural conclusion of the clinical requirement. But 6 weeks was the limit. Pushing further would require a new pretext. A new pretext meant new construction. New construction meant new seams in a cover that had already survived one near exposure and one unplanned disclosure and a visitor whose attention had never been fully explained. The operational judgment was not difficult. The mission had produced what it needed to produce. The clinical cover had a natural endpoint. Use it. Tel Aviv concurred. The exit would follow the wound. She arrived for what she had been told would be the final visit, carrying the same nursing bag she had carried into that building for the better part of a year. She conducted the assessment. She documented the healing. She gave him a final set of notes, care instructions, indicators to watch for, the name of a physician to contact if anything changed. Everything a thorough nurse provides at the close of a case. She was warm. She was professional. She said goodbye in the way that Lena Farhat would say goodbye, with the specific combination of genuine feeling and forward momentum that characterized a person from this community at the end of a professional engagement. Not cold. Not prolonged. The goodbye of someone who has other patients, other commitments, a life that continues past this doorway. He thanked her. He said something she would not include in the operational report. Not because it was sensitive. Because it was not operational. It belonged to a register the report had no field for. She walked out. Down the stairs, through the entrance, onto the street she had walked dozens of times in both directions. She did not look back. She walked the exit route for the last time and felt, with a precision that surprised her, the specific weight of a thing ending that she was not permitted to mourn. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of what she had produced began to move through the intelligence architecture in ways she could observe only partially and from a distance. The structural information she had gathered, the internal reporting chain, the confirmation extracted through Abu Tarek's correction, the ambient detail accumulated over months of visits, was not a standalone product. It was a contribution to a larger picture being assembled from multiple sources simultaneously. Signals intelligence. Other human assets. Surveillance data compiled over years. What her collection provided was confirmation and specificity. She had filled gaps that other collection methods could not fill because they required presence. Because they required a person in a room. Because they required someone Abu Tarek had decided to trust. The picture that emerged from this assembled intelligence contributed to targeting decisions she was informed of through official channels, in summary form, without the operational detail that would have told her precisely what her work had made possible. This is standard practice. Compartmentalization protects sources even after missions close. She was told the collection had been significant. She was told it had been used. She was not told everything it had been used for. She understood, from what she was told, and from what she was not told, that the consequences were real, that people whose names she did not know had made decisions based partly on information she had provided. That those decisions had produced outcomes in Lebanon that she would read about, later, in reports that did not mention her. This is what intelligence work looks like from inside it. Not the moment of collection. The long, quiet aftermath of having provided something that then moves through systems you do not control, toward ends you do not fully see, producing effects you cannot measure and are not permitted to claim. The first institutional consequence that touched her directly came 4 months after the exit. A review of the operation, conducted internally, flagged 2 elements for assessment. The first was the modified approach she had used during the collection phase. The decision to offer personal disclosure rather than angled questioning, as her handler had instructed. She had not fully reported this modification at the time. The review surfaced it through a cross-analysis of her reports against the collection outcomes, which showed a pattern inconsistent with the technique she had said she was using. The second was the slip. The unplanned personal disclosure that had resolved, improbably, into a deepening of the cover. She had reported it as a low-risk inconsistency. The review assessed it differently, not as a failure, but as an uncontrolled variable that had produced a positive outcome through factors outside operational management. In plain language, it had worked, but not because of anything she or Tel Aviv had done. It had worked because of something that could not be planned for and could not be relied upon. The review's conclusion was careful. The mission had produced significant intelligence yield. The operative had demonstrated exceptional field judgment in multiple high-pressure moments. The modified approach, while not sanctioned, had arguably produced better outcomes than the sanctioned approach would have. The slip had been managed with skill after the fact. But, a word that carries weight in institutional assessments. But an operation in which the field operative modifies the approved technique without disclosure, experiences an uncontrolled personal disclosure that is not fully reported, and develops a relational dynamic with a target that exceeds the parameters of standard source management, this is an operation that succeeded despite elements that should have been reported, not because of operational discipline alone. She was not reprimanded. She was reassigned. The reassignment was framed, in the language institutions use for such things, as a recognition of her capabilities and a desire to deploy them in a context suited to her profile. She understood what it meant. She had crossed a line that the institution could not formally name but could not ignore. The line between managing a source and becoming, in some way that could not be precisely defined, genuinely present with one. The longer consequence was harder to locate because it did not appear in any document. She had spent close to a year being Lena Farhad, not performing Lena Farhad. Being her, in the way that sustained deep cover requires, not as a costume but as a second self, inhabited fully enough that the person wearing it sometimes forgets, in small moments, that it is being worn. When the operation ended, Lena Farhad ended with it. The documents were retired, the legend was closed. The nursing bag went wherever those things go. What did not close was the accumulated experience of having been trusted, genuinely trusted, by a man who was very good at not trusting people, of having provided real care inside a constructed identity and found that the care did not feel constructed, of having let something real come through, accidentally, and watched it deepen a bond that should have been purely operational. She could not talk about this. Not to colleagues, not to a handler, not in any room that was not classified, and in the rooms that were classified, the language available for describing what had happened was operational language, which was not adequate to the things she was trying to describe. Former Mossad director Tamir Pardo said, in one of the few public statements senior Israeli intelligence officials have made about the use of female operatives, that the best of them possess the ability to suppress their ego in order to attain goals. He meant this as an observation about professional capability. He said it with evident respect. What he did not say, because it was not his experience to say, was what that suppression accumulates to. What it leaves behind in a person who has done it for long enough, at close enough range, with high enough stakes. She had suppressed herself into a person who did not exist. She had sustained that person through a year of genuine human contact, and when the operation ended, she found that the self she returned to was not quite the self she had left. Something had shifted in the space between the two. Not broken, not destroyed. Shifted, permanently and in a direction she had not consented to, because no one had told her to consent was something she might need to do. The intelligence she produced is somewhere in an archive that will not open for decades. What it cost to produce it is not in any archive. Operations like this one do not end when the operative walks out the door. They end, if they end at all, when the person who ran them finally finds language for what the work required of them. Some of them never do. The Mossad has a 50-year non-disclosure rule on operational security information. There is no rule governing how long it takes a person to process what they gave in order to collect it. The women who do this work do not ask for recognition. Most of them would not want it, because recognition requires explanation, and explanation requires language that the operational record does not contain. What they carried into those rooms, and what they carried out, belongs to a category of cost that intelligence history has not yet learned to measure. It may never learn.